Hi everyone. Welcome to our first recorded session. Let's see from current. There we go. We've been working our way through chapter 1 and through the introductory materials in Principles of Micro, and we have made it down through. Oops, hold on. I thought I had the pen on. We've made it down through marginal thinking. Okay. So we talked about scarcity and choice and opportunity cost and free lunches and rational choice, incentives, and good decisions being made on the margin. So I want to pick up with voluntary exchange, and we're going to work through the rest of these topics today, and then when we meet again, we will be beginning in chapter 2 with our first model. But first, today's joke. So there was a guy who went to see a psychiatrist, went to a psychiatrist's office and explained to the receptionist, please, I have to get in today. I really need to talk to the doctor. I'm invisible. And so the receptionist talks to him and then goes back to see the psychiatrist and explains to him, there's a man out there who says he's invisible. And the psychiatrist replies, just tell him I can't see him now. All right, insert groans there. This is sort of like being in class because behind the mask I can't see your disdain on your face. At any rate, voluntary exchange is mutually beneficial. Economists believe that trade makes people better off. That's not what I wanted. I was trying to get rid of the header at the top. There we go. That trade enlarges the social pie, that there is more wealth if there is voluntary exchange. Now, first of all, voluntary exchange, we mean people who purposefully and willingly trade something. If someone is forced into it, then it's not voluntary exchange, and the same thing doesn't apply. If you're getting mugged and someone says, give me your wallet, give me your money, or I'll beat you up, that's not a voluntary exchange, right? Your money for your life is not a voluntary exchange. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is when two people or two parties voluntarily swap things and both are made better off. And so my simplest proof of this is what happens at the point of exchange, in a transaction at a fast food place like this, or if you go to a mom and pop hardware store because you're looking for a particular pipe fitting and you talk to the owner and they get you what you need. What do people say at the end of a transaction like that? Well, one party probably says thank you. The other one might say you're welcome, but they might also say thank you as well, right? Both parties believe they are made better off. I go to Wegmans and I give essentially, through his employees, I give Danny Wegman a lot of money and I take a lot of groceries. That makes my family better off. And he seems perfectly happy to take my money and give me the groceries, right? That swap makes both parties better off. This applies, and early on, people figure this out. If two kids at the kindergarten table trade something, it's because they both expected to be better off with the other good than the first, and that, in the economist's mind, creates wealth. So voluntary exchange makes both parties better off, right? Creates wealth. Now, that's not to say that, we don't sometimes buy something and later on regret it, right? We're like, oh, this was low quality, or this doesn't work the way I thought, or I don't like this like I thought I would. Sometimes we make a bad decision that way, but at the point in time when we made the exchange, then we thought we would be better off. And honestly, most of the time we are, right? Okay, that one is quick and easy. That's voluntary exchange. Next up, models. All right, so models in economics. What are we talking about? No, not models like that. Though that is a Harvard-trained economist and reading actually a great book by Tyler Cowen. What we're talking about are models like this. What do you see in front of you right on the screen now? That is a model of the solar system. So the part of the class where I ask the questions and you actually answer them does not work as well or as interactively here. But if you were to describe a model, what words would you use? Usually I get things like simplification, representation, a smaller version. And that's it. A model abstracts from the complexities of the real world and simplifies it in a way that makes it more understandable. The solar system is hard to grasp, right? It's so enormous. We can only see a tiny part of one planet, and that's Earth. And Earth is huge, and yet it's tiny compared to the expanse of the solar system. So a model helps us understand a little bit about the size and the vast open space between planets, the size of the sun. But it simplifies a lot of things away, right? So that's what we do. We simplify and we strip things down to a level that's understandable. And to do that, we make assumptions. So we already talked about rationality. One of the assumptions we make in many economic models is that people are rational. Now, if that assumption is wrong, does that wreck our model? Well, as it turns out, it doesn't. So the strength of a model, right, the test of a model is its ability to predict, not the validity of its assumptions. Right? So the test of a model is its ability to predict. Does it do a good job of predicting, in our case, human behavior, right? Human action, the way people respond. In other fields, might predict other things. So the example I like to do in class, if we were all together, I would hold up a marker or something heavy and stand on whatever I could find that was tall enough to let me hold it up in the air, and then say, if I drop this, what will happen to it? Most of you would say, well, it'll fall down and hit the floor. And then I ask you, well, can we figure out how long that would take? Could we predict how long it would take? And so you have to think back, maybe even Google something, but eventually we come up with the acceleration constant from high school physics, and we put together that, things accelerate at 9.8 meters per second squared. And so if we could measure the distance between where I'm holding the marker and the floor, we could do a pretty good job of estimating how long it will take to fall. But does that constant, 9.8 meters per second squared, does it actually apply, in Basel 135 on Fisher's campus or any other room? Well, no, there are some assumptions. Right? There are some qualifications on 9.8 meters per second squared. As I recall, and high school physics was a while ago, that applies in a vacuum at sea level. And neither of those are true. Right? None of us are in a vacuum right now, at least I hope not. And as it turns out, we're probably not at sea level, although it would be fun to be at the beach. So even though those assumptions are false, can we still do a good job of estimating how long it will take? Well, yeah, those are fairly minor factors, and we strip them away or simplify them away. Now, if you work for NASA and you're planning the re-entry of a space vehicle, you probably need to factor in some of those higher level more complexities. But for a lot of people, estimating how long it'll take for that marker to drop, we can just sweep that away and simplify that away. So basically, we make assumptions to simplify a complex world to get it down to a level of simplicity that we can understand. Maybe we can look at a relationship between just a couple moving parts, concentrate on those, learn something about that relationship, and then extrapolate and use that to better understand the complex world that we live in. So that's the goal with models. We make simplifying assumptions, but the test of a model is its ability to predict, not whether or not those assumptions are true or false. When we get to Chapter 2, we'll do our first model. It's called the Production Possibilities Frontier, and you're going to see when we get to that, one of the first things we do is just assume that we live in a world with only two goods. Turns out we live in a world with hundreds of thousands or millions of goods and services to choose from, and I'm glad we do. But in order to better understand the trade-offs in producing them, we can simplify down to just two goods, and if we understand that, then we can better understand the complexities of the real world. So there you go. Those are models. That fits into the scientific method and how we do it. So we start basically with a research question, formulate a hypothesis, and then you use the model and testing to test that hypothesis. Right? Does the hypothesis hold up? So we might have a research question like, what does the fox say? I'm hoping that the sound is picked up not just through the speaker, but directly. Well, what does the fox say? You might come up with a hypothesis about the answer. And then is that really what the fox says? Well, I don't know. We'd have to test that model, right? So you'd go out in the real world and find a fox, ask them, talk to them, see what they say, and you could test that model, test that hypothesis, I should say, and see if it's accurate or not. So as another example, Olaf, from the movie Frozen, has a theory, has a hypothesis about what it would be like to be a snowman in summertime. He has a whole song dedicated to his hypothesis about summer, and how nice it would be to enjoy some warm weather. Do you think his hypothesis will hold up? Well, I suggest that it's already been tested. Do you remember the Christmas special, Frosty the Snowman? What happens when Frosty gets stuck in the greenhouse? It's not good, right? Fortunately, he has that magic hat. But that's testing Olaf's theory, and Olaf's hypothesis. I suggest it does not hold up well. But that's how science works. So there we go. That's models. Check off voluntary exchange. Nope. Where's my pen keeps going away. So check off voluntary exchange. Check off models. Under fallacies to avoid. What are fallacies? Fallacies are incorrect ways of thinking, right? Wrong thinking. Mistaken understandings about how the world works. So we're going to talk about 3 of them. And I know the world is full of fallacies. There's lots of wrong thinking out there. I want to highlight 3 that I want you to be aware of and avoid during, this semester, but going onward, right? The rest of your life, good to avoid wrong thinking. So the first one, now do I have to turn this off to turn the page? There we go. The first one is called the fallacy of composition. So let me see if I can write that here in a way that you can read it. The fallacy of composition. And the fallacy of composition is this, that what's good for the individual is good for the group. The fallacy of composition says that what's good for the individual is good for the group. And this is a picture of Growney Stadium or something like that, right? And so let's say you're over at Growney Stadium watching a football game back in a world where we have fall sports, and we have spectators, and hopefully we'll be there soon. Let's say you're at the stadium, you're watching a football game, and what if you want to see better, right? What if there's an exciting play and you want to see it better? What can you do as an individual? Well, you might stand up. You stand up, you get a better view of the field. That is true for the individual. Is that true for the group? If everybody stands up, does everybody get a better view? No, once everybody stands up, everyone has basically the same view that they had before. So it's true for the individual, it's not true for the group. That's an example of the fallacy of composition. Let's get rid of the... All right, do I turn this off and then turn the page? There we go. The next example is, there's a couple ways to describe it. It's really about correlation and causation, but you could also refer to it, if you like Latin, as the post hoc fallacy, Fallacy. That's a little bit sloppy there. I have a good eraser now. So, as a way of explanation, my Apple Pen is not working, but it does let me write with my finger. It's just not very good at that. The post hoc fallacy, it says basically that correlation is not equal to causation. So you think about the guy on the picture there, but let me give you my first example. Suppose that you are the statistician for the high school basketball team. And so all season you've been, sitting at the table at the half-court line, and you've been taking down all the stats, and you're looking through the book or the app if it's now on a tablet or something, and you have this moment this eureka moment, and you run to the coach's classroom. You're like, Coach, I figured it out. Hopefully you're both in a study hall or something at this point. Coach, every time you play the third string, we win big. Every time that you play the third string, right, the folks who don't get in every game, right, every time your coach plays them, they win big. Now, is that plausible? Could you go back through high school basketball stats books and find that correlation? And by the way, what do we mean by correlation? Things are observed together, right? Things occur together. I think you could. I think you could find a correlation in many cases between playing the third string and winning big. So what's the implication of that? Well, you, in this case, are like, well, coach, we need to play the third string more because every time we play the third string, we win big. So play them more big wins. So are they correlated? Yes. But are they causal? Is it playing the third string that causes the basketball team to have these blowout victories? That's the problem, right? It may be correlated. That doesn't mean it's causal. Is there another explanation for why you observe those together? Well, yeah, right? Whenever you're mismatched and you're steamrolling the opponent, the coach says, all right, this is a great opportunity to save the starters and to give playing time to other people who work hard but don't always get in, right? Because they are farther down the lineup. So, and it has the added bonus of being slightly more sportsmanlike, right? Rather than just running up the score on a weaker opponent. So there you go. They're correlated, but they're not necessarily causal. And in fact, the causation, there may be causation there, but it may run the other way. A big win, right? Mismatch, path to a big win might lead to the third string playing more. So just be careful of that. People have to, in economics and in science in general, people are looking for correlation, and then they have to come up with an explanation or a theory about why. So that can be the harder part. Anyway, a couple other examples of this. So who is this on the screen? If you said Moses, you're close. That's actually Charlton Heston playing Moses in the movie The Ten Commandments. I couldn't find any good pictures of Moses on the internet, but apparently it was not that photogenic. I don't know. In this, what's going on? What do you think is happening in this part of the movie? In this part of the story, Moses is holding his hands up, and the Red Sea is parting. Is Moses holding his staff and his arms up, parting the Red Sea? Or is it correlated? Because God told him to do that, and then God made the wind blow. Well, we'll figure that out. You ask your pastor. Oops, I didn't get it turned off to change the slide, don't I? Just two more examples of this. Internet Explorer versus the murder rate. People have collected this data and look at that. Between 2006 and 2011, Internet Explorer's market share was declining. So was the murder rate. Correlated? Yes. Causal? I'm not so sure. All right, and my last example, and my most fun one. Economists are notorious for using our tools and applying them to new areas. Right? We're shameless about it. And so there's some researchers in England who looked at the connection between frequency of sex and earnings, and they found that employees that have sex more than 4 times a week receive 5% higher wages. Right? So these are some English researchers, economic researchers. They got it published in a German journal. They found a statistically significant connection, right? Correlation. Does that mean it's causal? So all the economists, after reading this, who went home and said to their spouses, "Hey, honey, wouldn't it be great if I earned 5% more?" Right? Is it causal, or is it more likely that there's some underlying cause, that some people are more confident, more outgoing, better looking, and that some of these other characteristics might in fact lead to them both paying more and more frequent sex? So at any rate, things can be correlated, not necessarily causal. All right, the third and final fallacy that I want to talk about, right, in this section is the broken window fallacy. Broken window, 2 L's, and then I cannot write fallacy. The only word I keep repeating, and I cannot seem to get it right. Fallacy. Now, I'm going to give you the super quick version here because I actually have an outside reading for you. All right, so make a note here. What's the symbol for like whom? Make a note. In Blackboard, on the left, there is a tab that says Course Materials. And in there, there's some readings that over the course of the semester I will refer you to and ask you to read. So this is the first one of those. And so it's actually at the top of the list. It's called The Lesson and the Broken Window. It comes from a 1970s book called Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. And in there he tells, so it's the first two chapters, they're both very short. But the idea of the broken window comes from another story that was told by a Frenchman named Bastiat, I don't know, 100 years earlier. And so in that story, basically I want you to look at both of those chapters. They're quick and an easy read. In those, they talk about, he talks about the lesson, the seen and the unseen, right? Effects that are easily visible, and then effects that, consequences that are not, and that are easily overlooked. And that, I think, is the error or the fallacy here. And it comes from the story of the broken window, where overnight some hoodlums throw rocks through and break the big plate glass window in front of the baker's shop. And the next morning, early in the morning, as people are starting to walk the sidewalk, they see this and they stop and they look at it and they say, oh, how unfortunate for the baker. Right? His big, beautiful window is broken. Now he'll have to replace it. And then there's a cockeyed optimist in the group who says, well, look, it is unfortunate for the baker, but look at the new business this means for the glazier. That's the window repair guy, right? The guy who puts in the new windows. The glazier has this extra business. He'll have extra money, and then he might go buy shoes for his kids, or go out to eat, or go on vacation, or have a deck installed on the back of his house, whatever it is. And they start envisioning how this money will flow around their village or town, and they start to see this as a good thing, right? This is economic development, right? This is economic investment in their town. So, can you see their point? Well, yeah. But what are they missing? What's the error in what they're in their line of thinking? It's true that when the baker spends money on the window, you can trace it around town, right? The window guy has more money, and then he spends it in other places, and you can trace that and say, oh, look at this. There's an upside to this. Don't forget the opportunity cost, right? The opportunity cost is the part that's what's given up for this. And so the money circulating around town from the baker paying the window guy, that's the seen, as Hazlitt would call it. What's unseen is all the stuff the baker doesn't do because he had to spend a whole pile of money replacing his window. And so the fact that the baker doesn't buy, iPads for his kids, or shoes, or coats, or go take them on vacation, or take them to the movies, or go to the go-kart track. There's a whole bunch of things that the baker doesn't do because there's an opportunity cost, right? In a world of scarce resources, when the baker spends a pile of money on the window, he doesn't have that pile of money to spend on other things. But all of those things he doesn't do, those are not easily observable. And that's what people tend to forget, right? Scarce resources, choice, opportunity cost. People focus on one piece and they have blinders on, and they look at the money circulating on the new piece and they forget about the opportunity cost. That money didn't just magically appear, right? That money was spent on this thing, which means it wasn't spent or invested in something else. That's the part people forget. People make this mistake regularly. So almost anytime you have a natural disaster, you have some, horrible event, and I mean that seriously, like people's lives are endangered, sometimes lives are lost, property is destroyed, homes are destroyed. This is bad. And people are always looking for, how can we make this, better? What can we report that's better? So this is just something I picked up from a few years ago when there was a flood in Houston. But if you, almost anytime there's any major natural disaster, if you scour the op-ed pages in a newspaper or the online equivalent, you'll find something like this. So here's someone who wrote, floodwaters in and around Houston severely damaged or destroyed hundreds of thousands of cars and trucks, most of which will be replaced. Those new and used vehicle sales will benefit automakers and the economy, providing a glint of a silver lining amid terrible tragedy. Is that not the same thing they were saying about the baker's window? And it's true. Destruction of lots of cars is good news for the auto industry in some sense. But does that make it good news overall? If people have to spend a lot of money replacing their cars, does that have effects in other places? Well, yeah, maybe people go out to eat less. They go on shorter vacations, right, or stay closer to home. Maybe they don't invest in a graduate degree, or they don't do something else. They don't build that new deck or remodel their bathroom. So all of these things they don't do because they were sort of compelled to spend money replacing their car, that doesn't show up. That's the opportunity cost. That's what Hazlitt calls the unseen, and that's the part people forget about. You get all excited about the new cars, or whenever there's a hurricane on the coast and it destroys property and people have to rebuild and remodel and fix. That's business for the construction industry, right? And no doubt that is good for them. But does that mean it's good overall? Well, we spend a whole bunch of resources just to replace and repair and get back to where we were 6 months ago, and now that money is spent and we don't have it to do other renovations or changes or updates. We don't have it for technology or new equipment for our business or vacations or fun things for our family. So that's the thing that people forget about that I don't want you to. So check out those readings, the lesson and the broken window. The other thing that I wanted to note here, like in the case of the cars in Houston, there is an added level of complexity here, and that's insurance. So it does add complexity, but it doesn't change the intuition at the end of the day. In the story Bastiat tells from 100 years ago or more, the money is basically coming right out of the baker's pocket. Now, for most of these people, their cars are insured, right? For many of these people in Houston, their cars are insured, so all the money doesn't come out of their pocket. They'll get, they'll file an insurance claim and get money from the insurance company. Now, that money may not cover the full cost of a new car, right? They'll get sort of the quote replacement cost of the car that they had, which might have been 4 years old and had 50,000 miles on it. So it may not cover the full cost of what they decide to get, but it'll offset some of it. But at the end of the day, that doesn't matter. It doesn't change the fact that resources spent for replacing cars are not available for other things. Where does the insurance company get the money to pay out on those claims? Well, they get it from insurance premiums. And where do the premiums come? Well, those come from individuals and households. And so at some level, if the insurance company has an unusually large payout, that means that their reserves have gone down and that eventually they have to either raise premiums, or if they could have otherwise held premiums constant or reduced them, they don't do that, right? And premiums go up because they have to replenish their reserves for other future payouts. So it may disperse exactly which household bears the cost, but at the end of the day, the money for all the insurance claims comes from individuals, and so individual households still bear that burden. All right. Normally I would say questions, but I won't hear you. So there we covered 3 different fallacies, right? Fallacy of composition, correlation and causation, or the post hoc fallacy, and then the broken window fallacy. So now we just have these 2 sort of minor things left to talk about: positive and normative economics, and then micro and macroeconomics. So positive and normative, this gets at what we call a positive statement or a normative statement. So a positive statement is a statement of fact. It's a claim about the state of the world, and it's testable. So one of the most important things you want to note here, in fact, let me do this on the next slide, is note that a positive statement is testable. So it's a claim about the state of the world, right? It's a claim of fact. So if I said, this chair has 4 legs, that's a claim of fact, that's testable. Now, if I said, this chair has 7 legs, that's also testable. It might be false. Don't confuse true or false, accurate or inaccurate, with a claim of fact, a testable, because if you test something, you could find out that it's true, or you could find out that it's false. Now, contrast that to a normative statement. A normative statement involves some sort of value judgment. That says value judgment, it's supposed to, or opinion. Right? There's opinion or value judgment wrapped up in it. So if I said, this chair is aesthetically, better looking than that chair, well, that involves my opinion or my value judgment. You can't test that. Now, some other people might agree with me, but some people might disagree with me. It doesn't make any of us right or wrong. Okay? So, let me give you a more, econ example. If I said an increase in the minimum wage leads to unemployment, an increase in the minimum wage causes unemployment, is that a positive statement or a normative statement? Well, that's a positive statement, right? That's testable. In fact, economists do try to figure out the effect of increases in the minimum wage. So a binding increase in the minimum wage, most economists find does lead to some level of unemployment. It's a fairly small effect, but most economists find that increases in the minimum wage lead to unemployment, and they find especially it especially applies to young people and minorities. They're affected more by, there's greater unemployment among the very young people and also among minorities as a result of a binding increase in the minimum wage. But now, what about the question, should we have a minimum wage? Should we increase the minimum wage? What should the minimum wage be? That's a normative question. That's a policy judgment, and that involves some opinion or value judgment as well. So if I said we should raise the minimum wage to $20 an hour, is that a positive statement or a normative statement? Is that a positive claim about the state of the world that you can test? Well, no, that's a value judgment. And so as a hint, if the statement includes the word should or ought to, that's a big clue that it's a normative statement. Now, a normative statement does not have to include those words. So don't use that as your only guide for distinguishing them, because it won't always work. But it always has that sense. Right? So if I said the optimal minimum wage is $20 an hour, that is still a normative statement. Economics is a positive science. We try to help understand what are the effects. So we try to understand and measure the effects of increasing the minimum wage. Economics by itself doesn't tell us whether or not we ought to have a minimum wage or how high it ought to be. People's worldview and value judgments get tied up in that as well. But it can help us make better policy decisions if we really understand, well, how big are the minimum wage effects, and compare that to how big the gains are to lots of other low-skilled employees who now have more money. That can help us make that policy decision. So there you go. Positive statements, testable. Normative statements involve value judgment. But economics is a positive science. We're trying to understand how things work and understand the facts about the world and how things work in order to inform and make better normative judgments. So, positive and normative. The last thing, this one is super straightforward. Micro and macro. This is a class about microeconomics, right? Micro is the smaller part here in a sense. But it's not actually smaller. I see the world in terms of microeconomics, and I see it everywhere. I almost see it as more prevalent or relevant in some ways. But it really has to do with individual decisions. I'm not going to fit that. Oh, we can fit that on there. Individual decisions. Decisions made at the level of the individual or the household or the firm. But that's the stuff of micro. Macro, and I've had some teachers say there's no difference, right? It's all economics. But the difference, macro, is really about big picture outcomes. So macro is the one that talks about GDP and unemployment and inflation, right? And those big economy-wide outcomes. Those big economy-wide outcomes, they're largely the result of lots and lots and lots, many individual level decisions. So individual households respond to the interest rate and the money supply, and they make individual decisions, and then the sort of agglomeration of all of those leads to big picture outcomes like GDP. So that's the difference. We don't need to sweat over that. Just understand that in this course, we are concentrating on micro. We're looking at the decisions made at the individual or household or firm level. And then if you go on and take 106, or if you've already taken 106, or principles of macro, then you'll look more at those big picture outcomes in terms of, money supply and inflation and GDP and those sort of things. So that's what to expect here. I think I've got one more car picture. I don't have any good pictures for micro and macro, so anything that looks big and small I find to be interesting, I guess. That's it for chapter 1. That should wrap up those topics. The next time we meet, we'll be talking about chapter 2 in our first model, the PPF. In the meantime, if you have questions, shoot me an email. And otherwise, I look forward to our next meeting. Take care, everyone.